The men at the Cracker Barrel laughed when Frances Whitmore asked her question, and the storekeeper laughed too, and one of them, a long, thin man with tobacco in his teeth, said loud enough for the whole mercantile to hear, "Ask Calder. He's got an oven nobody's lit since his wife died, and you look like you'd fit the doorway only sideways." Frances did not flinch. She did not turn her head. She did not let her hand tighten on the strap of the carpet bag she had set on the counter. She only looked at the storekeeper, who would not meet her eyes, and asked him in the same even voice she had used the first time, how far up the creek road the Calder place sat. He told her. 6 miles. He told her it without looking up, and she thanked him by name, because she had read the name off the sign above the door coming in, and a person who had a name deserved to be called by it even when he would not return the courtesy. She picked up her bag. She walked out into the late September sun. The laughter behind her did not stop until the screen door closed, and even then she heard one more bark of it through the wood, and something inside her cracked open, not the part of her that hurt, which was old and walled, and would not be touched by men like these, but the part that had been waiting 400 miles on a stagecoach for one place on God's earth where she would not have to start over again from the bottom of a stranger's contempt. If this story already has your chest tight, do me one small kindness before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button and follow Frances Whitmore all the way to the end of her road, because she is going to walk a long way before this is finished. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Frances's story travels. The road up Hollis Creek in the fall of 1883 climbed slow out of the town and ran along the water, and the water was low that year and clear as window glass over the river rocks. Frances walked it carrying her one trunk on her shoulder for the first half-mile, and then she set the trunk down behind a cottonwood and walked the rest with only her carpet bag, because the trunk was heavier than her pride, and she had a long enough afternoon ahead of her without breaking her back over a thing she could come back for in the morning. The dust came up over her boots. The sun came down warm on the brim of her hat. She passed a wagon coming the other way, and the man on the box looked at her once, and then looked at her again, and then looked straight ahead at the ears of his mule, and she let him. She had been looked at by every kind of man there was. The kind who looked once and went on with their lives were the easiest kind. It was the kind who could not stop looking, and the kind who would not look at all. That wore on a woman after a while. She was 41 years old. She had cooked for a boarding house in Cheyenne for 11 years, and for a cattle outfit out of Ogallala for 6 before that. And her last employer, a widow named Hetty Cordell, who had run the cleanest house in eastern Wyoming, had died in March of a thing the doctor called a sudden stoppage of the heart, and Frances called the long, slow wait of being alone with no one to cook for at the end of the day. The letter of reference Hetty had written her 3 winters before, in case anything ever happened, was folded against Frances's ribs inside her dress. It said that Frances Whitmore could stretch a barrel of flour across 40 men, and not one of them would leave the table hungry, and that she kept a kitchen the way a banker kept a vault, and that whoever hired her next would be a fool to ever let her go. Lo! Hetty had read the letter aloud to her before she sealed it. Frances had not cried. She had only said thank you, and Hetty had said, "Don't thank me. It's the plain truth, and you ought to hear it spoke out, at least once in your life, by someone who knew." Frances had carried the letter 400 miles. She had not yet found a man she trusted to give it to. The Calder place came up on her at dusk. She heard it before she saw it, the creek running along on her left, and the small steady sound of leather being worked somewhere ahead. The road bent through a stand of pine and opened out. And there was the yard, and there was the house, and there was a man bent over a sawhorse mending a bridle in the last of the orange light. The yard told her things before the man did. There were no chickens. The woodpile was small and unsorted. The bunkhouse off to the left had 2 windows lit, and 3 windows dark, and a shutter hanging by one hinge, and the rope on the well was frayed at the lip in a way a careful hand would have spliced 6 months ago. Purred. The barn doors were standing open, and the inside of the barn was tidy in a starved kind of way, the way a place was tidy when there was not enough being asked of it to make any mess. Off behind the house she could see the kitchen garden, what was left of it, gone to weed in long rows that had once been hoed straight. A man lived here. A man had been living here a long time the way a person lives, in a coat he has forgotten to take off. She stopped at the gate. She did not call out. She waited for him to lift his head, because a woman walking up out of the dusk into a man's yard at supper time was a thing he ought to be allowed to register on his own time. He lifted his head. He set the bridle down on the sawhorse. He stood up to his full height, which was tall, and he wiped his hands on the front of a shirt that had once been a good shirt and had since been washed too many times in hard water. And he looked at her. He did not flinch. She had been watching for it without meaning to watch for it. It was a thing she watched for the way a person who has been bitten by a dog watches the hands of every man she meets. The flinch came in different shapes from different men. Sometimes it was a small step back. Sometimes it was the eyes going to her shoulders, and then to her waist, and then sliding off her like water off a roof. Sometimes it was a laugh covered with a cough. Sometimes it was a kindness so loud and so fast it was its own kind of flinch, a man rushing to prove he had not noticed by noticing nothing else for a quarter of an hour. Holt Calder did none of these things. He looked at her the way he had looked at the bridle a moment before, like a thing in front of him that had come into his evening, that he would now consider. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. "My name is Francis Whitmore. I came up from town." "You walked it?" "I walked it." He took that in. He did not say anything about it. He glanced past her shoulder, as if to confirm she had come up alone, and then he came around the sawhorse, and stopped at a polite distance, and stood waiting. "I was told in town," she said, "that you have an oven that has not been used in some time." He did not move. Something passed across his face that was not a flinch and was not anger, and was not anything she could name. It went, and his face was the same face again. "That's true," he said. "I have a letter of reference," she said. "I won't trouble you with it tonight. I'd like to ask you a plain thing. I'd like to use your oven for one night. I will bake bread, I will sell the loaves in town tomorrow morning. I will pay you for the wood and the use of the kitchen out of what I make. I will be out of your way by noon, and you will not see me again. Unless you want to." He looked at her a long moment. "You'll be out of the way by noon," he said. "Yes." "Why, bread." "Because there's nothing else I can make at this hour, with what I can guess you have in your pantry, and bread is the thing a town will buy in the morning whether it knew last night that it wanted any." He almost smiled. It did not get all the way to his mouth. It got as far as the corner of one eye, and stopped there. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Miss," she said. "Francis is fine, Miss Whitmore." He reached into his trouser pocket. He brought out a ring of keys. He worked one of them off the ring with his thumb. He held it out to her, flat on his palm. "The kitchen's been closed a long time. It'll want airing. The flour barrel's in the pantry off the back. There's an old apron on the peg behind the door. That ought to fit." He paused on that last word in a way another man might not have, and she watched him decide not to fix it, because, fixing it would have been the flinch he was refusing to give her. Pumps by the back step. Wood stacked on the south side of the house. There's a tinderbox on the mantel. If anything's gone bad in there, set it out on the porch, and I'll see to it in the morning. She took the key. It was warm from his pocket. "Thank you," she said. He said. He went back to his bridle. He did not watch her walk to the house. He did not call after her any of the small things a man might call after a strange woman entering his kitchen at dusk. He let her go in on her own, the way he would have let a horse go into a strange stall on its own to settle, and she understood as she climbed the porch step that this was the first kindness Holt Calder had done a stranger in a long while, and that he had done it without making a show of it, and that it cost him more than he was going to let her see. The kitchen door stuck. She set her shoulder to it, and it gave with a sigh of old hinges, and the dark inside the room smelled of cold ash and old flour and the dry, sweet ghost of cinnamon a careful woman had kept in a tin on a shelf 4 years ago. Frances stood in the doorway a moment before she stepped in. There was a way you walked into a kitchen that had belonged to a dead woman. You did not bustle. You did not throw open the windows like you owned the air. You stepped in, and you let the room know you were there, and you waited to see if the room would let you stay. She set her carpetbag on a chair. She crossed to the window over the sink, and worked the sash up an inch, and then another inch, and then all the way, and the cool creekside evening came in. She lit the lamp on the table with a match from her own pocket, because the tinder box on the mantel was a thing she did not yet feel she had the right to touch. She went to the stove and laid her hand flat on the cold iron of the cooktop, and she stood there with her hand on it long enough to know the stove, the way you knew a person by the bones of it under your palm. It was a good stove. Heavy. American-made. 6 lids, a warming oven, and a firebox built deep enough to hold a fire through a winter night. The hinges of the firebox door were stiff but not rusted. Someone had banked the last fire in it carefully. Someone had wiped it down before she walked out of the room and never came back. Frances breathed out slow. "All right," she said to the stove. "Quiet. Let's see what you remember." She went through the pantry first. She did it the way she did everything in a strange kitchen, which was in order and without hurry. The flour barrel was 3/4 full, and the flour in it was sound, though it had a slight dryness at the top that told her it had been opened recently, which she filed away to think about later. There was lard in a crock under a cloth, and the lard was good. Salt in a wooden box. A tin of baking soda that was 3 years old, and had hardened into a brick she would chip out with a knife in the morning. Sugar in a smaller barrel, less than half. Coffee beans in a jar. 3 tins of tomatoes from somebody's put-up summer, 2 summers gone. A side of bacon in muslin that was past its best but not past use, and a smoked ham that was honest. She made her tally as she went, the way she had always made it. In her head, and not on paper, every item with its weight and its worth. The pantry of a man who had been signing supply bills without reading them for 4 years told her one thing very loud. He was paying for 2 of everything and getting 1. She did not let herself look at the small things on the windowsill. There were small things on the windowsill, a blue tin cup with a chip in the rim, a sprig of something long dried in a clear bottle, a wooden spoon worn smooth on one side by a right hand that had stirred 10,000 pots with it. They were not hers to look at. She built her fire. She built it the way her mother had taught her, kindling first in a small tent, then the split pine, then the harder oak laid over the top once the pine had caught. The stove drew well. The smoke went straight up the pipe and out, and the kitchen began to warm. She mixed her bread. She mixed it by feel, the way she always did, because scales lied and hands did not. She used the flour from the top of the barrel and not the bottom, because she did not yet know the cellar and would not chance bringing up something damp. She used a pinch of the brick-hard soda after she chipped a corner off it, and dissolved it in warm water. She used the lard. She used a measure of the sugar, smaller than she would have liked, because she did not know yet what he had and what he did not. She mixed, and she kneaded, and she set the dough in 2 big crocks she found on a shelf. And she covered the crocks with clean flour sacks she found folded in a drawer where a woman had folded them, and she set the crocks on the warming shelf above the stove to rise. Then she sat down at the kitchen table in a dead woman's chair because there was nowhere else to sit, and she let herself rest for the first time since the stagecoach. Holt came in around 9. He came in the back door, not the front, and he took his hat off in the doorway, and stayed in the doorway. And she understood, without him saying so, that the kitchen was a room he did not yet walk into. "Smells like something," he said. "It will," she said, "another hour." He looked at the crocks on the warming shelf. He looked at the lamp on the table. He looked at the open window and the air moving the curtain. He did not look at the small things on the sill. And he did not let his eyes catch on the empty chair across from her. "There's a bunk you can have in the house tonight," he said. "Back bedroom, sheets are clean. I'll be in the office." "That's a kindness," she said. He said. He started to turn. He stopped. "Miss Whitmore. Francis. Francis." He said it like a word he was trying out for the weight. 6 miles is a long walk." "It is." "You left a trunk." "I did." "I'll send a man in the morning." "Thank you." He nodded once and he went, and she sat at the table a while longer listening to the dough breathe under its cloth. And then she got up and punched it down and shaped her loaves, and set them in pans she had found above the pie safe. And she fed the firebox 1 more split of oak, and she sat down again. And at some point in the second rise, she put her head down on her arms on the table for what she meant to be a moment, and she slept there. She woke at 4 in the morning the way a cook wakes, which is all at once, and to the smell of her own kitchen. The fire had burned down low and even, and the loaves had risen tall and pale in their pans, and she slid them into the oven and closed the iron door and stood up and stretched her back, and she put coffee on. She put on the big pot, the one a working ranch used, because if there were men in that bunkhouse they would be up at 5, and they would not have smelled coffee from this house in 4 years, and she would not be the woman who let that go on for another morning. The bread came out at 6, 8 loaves, gold-crusted, the sound of them under her knuckle hollow and right. She set them on the table to cool. She wrapped 4 in a clean towel to take to town. The other 4 she sliced thick, and she cut into the smoked ham, and she fried the slices in lard in the big skillet, and she beat what eggs she had found in a basket on the back porch. The chickens were not all dead then. She filed that away too, into a yellow pan and scrambled them with salt and a little pepper from a pepper mill that ground rough. And she set the table for 10 because she had counted 4 lit windows in the bunkhouse, and the office, and herself, and Holt, and 2 empty chairs, for whoever might come, and she stepped to the back porch, and she rang the iron bell that hung there. She rang it once. She did not ring it twice. Cooks who rang twice were not respected. There was a silence, and then there was the sound of boots. And then the back door of the bunkhouse opened, and a man stepped out into the cold blue dawn, and then another behind him. And they stood there looking across the yard at the kitchen with the lamp lit in the window, and a heavy woman in an apron standing on the porch, with a bell in her hand and the smell of bread and ham and coffee coming off the house in a wave. The first man through the kitchen door was tall and lean and yellow-haired, with a face that had decided some years ago that it was handsome and had not been corrected since. He stopped on the threshold. He looked at her. He looked at the table. He looked at the loaves, cooling on the sideboard. He looked at her again, slow, top to bottom, and he gave a soft, low whistle through his teeth that he meant her to hear. "Boys," he said over his shoulder, "come and see. The boss has hired us a cook by the pound." The men behind him laughed. It was a small laugh. It was the laugh of men who had been hungry for a long time, and were not quite sure yet whether they were allowed to be pleased about it, and who were taking their cue from the man in front. Frances did not look at him. She turned to the stove and lifted the coffee pot off the heat with a folded cloth, and she carried it to the table and set it down at the head where she had put a clean cup, and she said, in the level voice she used for men who had not yet earned a sharper one, "Sit down. It's getting cold." They sat down. There were 6 of them. The yellow-haired man took the head of the table, which was Holt's chair, and looked at her over the coffee pot to see whether she would say a word about it. She did not. She poured his cup first, because he had sat in the chair, and she poured the rest around the table. And she set the platter of ham and eggs in the middle, and she sliced a loaf of bread end to end, and laid the slices out on a plate, and she said grace under her breath for them, because none of them had thought to. They ate. They ate the way men eat who have been fed badly for 4 years. They did not talk. They did not look up. The yellow-haired man took 3 slices of bread off the plate at the start, and a 4th before he had finished his eggs, and then a 5th, and he ate the 5th slowly, because he had realized part-way through the meal that there was no shame in eating a 5th slice when the woman who had made it was standing 4 feet away, pretending not to count. By the end of the meal, the platter was empty, and the bread plate was empty, and a whole loaf was gone, and Frances had sliced a 2nd loaf and set it down without being asked, and that loaf was gone too. And 3 of them had taken 2nd cups of coffee, and one of them, a small, dark man at the foot of the table, and one of them, perhaps 22 years old, looked up at her and said, in a voice that cracked, "Ma'am. Thank you." The yellow-haired man wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and looked at her across the wreckage of his plate, "Dast. You got a name, big girl? Frances Whitmore? Frances Whitmore?" He let it sit in his mouth. "I'm Tate. I'm lead hand here. Anything in this kitchen happens because I say so. You understand me?" She did not say what she understood. "How long's the boss got you for?" "That's between the boss and me." He laughed, once, and pushed his chair back, and stood up. He was a head taller than her standing, and he made sure she felt it. He walked past her on his way to the door, close enough that his shoulder brushed her apron, and she did not move, and he stopped in the doorway and said over his shoulder, "Well, you can stay till the bread runs out anyway." He went. The others went after him. The small, dark man at the foot of the table, he was called Bert, she would learn later, though this Bert was young Bert, a different Bert from the old one she would meet that week, touched the brim of his hat to her on the way out, and the door closed behind them. And Frances stood alone in the kitchen, with the smell of food in it for the first time in a long time, and her hands flat on the back of a chair, and her breath even. And she did not let herself sit down, because the day was not yet half started, and a cook, who sat down in the morning, did not stand up again at noon. Holt came in through the inside door at the back of the kitchen at 6:30. He had a cup in his hand. He had heard the bell, and he had not come, and she understood that too. He stopped 2 paces inside the doorway and looked at the table, the empty platter, the crumbs on the cloth, the cooling loaves stacked on the sideboard, the 2nd pot of coffee, already going on the back of the stove. "You fed them," he said. "I fed them, all of them, 6 of them. There's plates for 2 more if anyone else turns up." He looked at the sideboard. He looked at the loaves. "You said you were going to sell that bread in town." "I'm going to sell 4 loaves in town. The other 4 were for here. I made 8 because I didn't know what you had for breakfast for your men, and now I do. What do I have for breakfast for my men? Not enough." He looked at her then. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the yard the night before, considering. He set his cup down on the table. "Miss Whitmore?" Frances. He drew a breath. "I'd take it as a kindness if you'd stay the week." "At what wages you name them?" $2 a week and my keep, and the use of the kitchen for what I bake for town on the side, and what I make there is mine. Done. And one more thing. Name it. I'd like to look at your pantry today with you standing in it, and your beef hung in the smokehouse. And your flour barrel. I'd like you to see what I see when I look at them." He was quiet a moment. "All right," he said. That was the day she began to understand the shape of what was wrong on the Calder place. And it was the day whole Calder began, without saying so, to let her. She walked him through the pantry first. She did not point at things. She did not lecture. She said, "This barrel is short, by about 12 pounds. For what a barrel that size ought to weigh full to the chime. See how the chime stands proud here. How the flour line sits below it." She said, "This lard is good lard, but you paid for the price of butcher's lard out of a Kansas City stockyard, and this is rendered out of a hog you fed yourself last winter, which means somebody charged you for what you already owned." She said, "The sugar barrel here has been topped up with a cheaper sugar at the back taste, and the cheaper sugar is what's billed at the better price." He tasted. He did not say anything. He chewed the second pinch a long time. She walked him out to the smokehouse. She lifted the corner of a side of beef on its hook with one hand, to feel the give of it. She said, "This is a good animal. But it's been hanging 2 weeks longer than it should have. Which means somebody was supposed to butcher it down and didn't." She walked him to the smaller shed where the supply wagon dropped its goods, and she pointed without touching at the way the boards under the scale had been worn unevenly, a long, shallow dip on the side the weights sat on. "Your scale's been off true a year at least," she said. "Not by accident. A man set a wedge under the long arm at some point, and then took the wedge out and left the floor, remembering it." He stood looking at the boards a long minute. "Who taught you to read a floor like that?" he said. "A widow named Hetty Cordell in Cheyenne. She taught me to read everything. She's still alive." "No." He nodded. He did not say he was sorry. She was glad of it. That night she made supper for 9, the 6 hands, and Holt and herself and an old man named Bert, who had wandered in from the west pasture at the smell of food, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand like a stray dog, until she had told him through the window to come in and wash up. This Bert was an old hand. He was 60, if he was a day, and he had been on the Calder place since before there was a Mrs. Calder, and he ate his supper that night, slow and careful, and with the small steady tears of a man who had not realized until he had a hot plate in front of him how long it had been since anyone had cared whether he ate. He did not say anything to her at the table, but when she came around with the coffee at the end, he caught her wrist with 2 fingers, gentle, and he said, "Ma'am, God bless you," and he let her go. She walked the bread to town the next morning and sold all 4 loaves at the mercantile to the storekeeper himself for 15 cents apiece, and he took them without meeting her eye, and counted out the coins on the counter. And she stood in front of him with her hand on the coins, and she said, quiet enough that the men at the Cracker Barrel could not hear, "Mr. Pell, I'm cooking at the Calder place. If you've a mind to do business with me, you do it like a man, and not like a boy. We understand each other?" He looked up at her then, for the first time. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She walked back up the creek road with the coins in her pocket and her trunk on the bed of a small wagon Holt had sent down for it, driven by the young dark-haired hand from breakfast, whose name was Cleve, and she sat up on the bench next to Cleve, and looked at the water running on her left, and she did not let herself believe yet that she had found a place. She had been wrong about places before. The first week ran like that. She baked twice a day, she fed them 3 times. She turned out the pantry, and washed every shelf, and set the soda brick to soak. She found 2 more hams, the smokehouse had forgotten, and a crock of pickled beets in the cellar, that had survived 4 years on the strength of being put up by a woman who knew what she was doing. She walked the kitchen garden with a hoe she found leaning against the well, and she cleared 4 rows of weeds in an afternoon, and she found, under the weeds, 3 rows of turnips that had reseeded themselves and gone wild, and that would feed the bunkhouse through November if she let them be a week longer. She kept her tally in her head. Eggs from the 4 hens that were left. Milk from the 1 cow that was still in milk, because Cleve had taken pity on it and was milking it on his own time. Flour out, lard out, sugar out, bread sold in town, and what it brought. She watched Holt at supper without watching him. He ate at the head of the table now, in his own chair, because Tate had moved 1 place down without comment on the second night, and she had not had to ask. Holt ate quietly. He took seconds twice that week, and the second time he took them, she saw him register, in a small motion of his shoulders, that he had taken seconds, and that he had not been a man who took seconds for some long time. He did not look at her when he did it. She did not look at him. Quote, but she set the dish closer to his elbow the next night, and the night after that, and by the 4th night the dish lived on his side of the table, without comment from either of them. She watched the supply wagon come on Wednesday. It came up from town at noon, a flat wagon with a tarp over it, and 2 men on the box, and the name of the Feed and Supply Concern painted on the side in faded green letters, Hollis Creek Feed and Supply C. She watched the men unload. She watched them weigh the flour on the scale that she had told Holt was off true, and she watched the way the long arm of the scale rested 1/8 of an inch lower than it ought to have rested, and she watched the man on the box take Holt's signature on a bill of lading without showing him the figure on the bill until after his pen was on the paper. She did not interfere. She watched. When the wagon had gone, she went into the office, where Holt was sitting at his desk with the bill spread in front of him, not reading it. And she said, "May I?" He pushed it across to her. She read it. She read the bill for a barrel of flour Hetty Cordell could have bought in Cheyenne for $3.20, and the figure on the bill was $4.90. She read the bill for 100 pounds of cracked corn, and the figure was nearly double what 100 pounds of cracked corn ought to fetch off any wagon in the territory. She read the line for sugar, and the line for salt, and the line for the lamp oil, and she did her sums in her head, which was a thing she could do faster than most men could do them on paper, and she set the bill back down on the desk, and she said, Mr. Pring. Calder Holt. Holt, you are paying about twice what a man ought to pay for what's on this paper." He did not answer for a long time. He looked at the bill. He did not pick it up. "I figured," he said. "I was paying some extra. For the trouble of bringing it up the creek, you're paying twice. And there's a brown envelope on your mantel." He looked up at her. "From the bank," she said. "Yes, how long has it sat there?" "Since June. This is September." "I know what month it is, Francis." There was a small heat in his voice that had not been there before, and she watched him hear it himself, and watched him decide not to apologize for it. "I won't open it for you," she said. "It's not mine to open. But I'll tell you a thing, and you can do with it what you want. A man who doesn't open a bank envelope for 3 months is not a man who's behind on his payments. He's a man who already knows what the envelope says." He looked at her then in a way he had not yet looked at her. "Get back to the kitchen, Francis," he said. He said it not unkindly. He said it the way a man says, "Go on, I need a minute." She got back to the kitchen. That night she heard him, very late, in the front room. She heard the sound of paper. She did not get up. She did not go in. The morning the envelope was gone from the mantel, and she did not ask where, and Holt at breakfast looked like a man who had not slept. And he ate his eggs, and he drank his coffee, and he said, before he went out, "Francis, stay the month. At what wages? $3 a week, and your keep. $3.50. Done. He went out. Tate was the trouble that week, the way she had known he would be. He had taken her measure on the first morning, and he had decided she would be a thing he handled, and a man like Tate, having decided that, would test his decision against the world until the world either confirmed it or broke it. And oppression. He did the small things first. He came into the kitchen without knocking. He sat down at the table at hours that were not meal times and asked for coffee, in atonement to remind the other hands that he could ask. He told a story at supper on the fourth night about a fat woman in a saloon in Abilene, and watched her face for the flinch he wanted, and she gave him the same face she gave the kettle. And he stopped the story halfway through, because no one at the table was laughing, and Holt at the head of the table was looking at his plate in a way that meant the story would not be finished. On the fifth night he moved her trunk. Mo. She came up from the cellar with a crock of beans for soaking, and found the back bedroom door standing open, and her trunk gone from the foot of the bed where she had set it. She stood in the doorway with the crock against her hip, and she did not say anything. She set the crock down on the floor. She walked out to the yard. Her trunk was sitting in the dirt in front of the barn door, with the lid down but the clasp undone, and Tate was leaning on the corner of the barn with his arms folded, watching for her to come and find it. He had 3 of the hands with him. Cleve was not among them, and Bert, the old hand, was not among them, and she made a small note of who Tate could and could not gather, and she filed it. "Thought you'd be more comfortable out here," he said. "Easy, plenty of room. Hay's soft. The boys figured we ought not to crowd you in the house." Frances looked at the trunk. She did not look at him. "Mr. Tate," she said. Tate, Mr. Tate, said, "You will pick up that trunk, and you will carry it back to the room I am sleeping in, and you will set it down at the foot of the bed, and you will close the door behind you. On the way out. You will do it now." He laughed. He pushed off the barn. "And if I don't, big girl." A door opened on the porch behind her. She did not turn. She heard the boots come down the porch steps and across the dust of the yard, and she watched Tate's face change, watched the easy thing in it pull tight, and then go careful, and Holt walked past her without looking at her, and stopped 2 feet from Tate and stood there with his hands at his sides. "Tate," Holt said. "Boss, you will pick up that trunk." "Boss, I was only—" "You will pick up that trunk, and you will carry it back into the house, and you will set it down at the foot of the bed in the back bedroom, and you will close the door behind you on the way out. You will do it now. And the next time you put a hand on a thing that belongs to a woman in my house without her say-so, you will draw your time, and you will be off this place before sundown. Do you hear me?" Tate looked at him. Tate was a head taller than Holt. "Wha?" He looked at him a long moment. "I hear you," he said. He picked up the trunk. He carried it back to the house. He went up the porch steps and into the back hall and through to the bedroom. And he set the trunk down at the foot of the bed, and he closed the door behind him on the way out, and he came back down off the porch and he walked past Holt without looking at him, and went into the bunkhouse and did not come out again until morning. Holt stood in the yard a moment longer, then he turned to her. "Frances, Holt, are you all right?" "I am. I'm sorry, don't be." He looked at her, then. He looked at her in the last of the light, with the dust still settling around their boots. And he looked at her the way a man looks at a woman, not the way a man looks at a cook he has hired, or a stranger who has come up out of town, or a problem he is handling. And she saw him see her, and she saw him register that he had seen her, and she watched him not look away. He did not move toward her. He did not say anything else. But he stood there a beat longer than he needed to stand there, and she stood there a beat longer than she needed to stand there, and then he said, "Supper smells good," and she said, "It is," and he went back up the steps and into the house, and Frances Whitmore stood in the yard a moment, with one hand against her own elbow, and she breathed once, long, and went in after him. She did not let herself think about it that night. She was 41 years old, and she had been looked at by enough men in her life to know that one long look in a darkening yard from a widower who had not opened his own kitchen door in 4 years was not the beginning of anything. It was a thing. It was not nothing. She would not make it more than it was. She fed the men. She washed the plates. She banked the fire. She went to bed in the back bedroom, with her trunk at the foot of it where it belonged. And she lay awake a while listening to the creek run, under the window, and she did not think about Holt Calder's face. And then she did, and then she slept. The old man Bert came to her at the back step on Saturday evening. He had been at the bottle. He was not falling down drunk. He was the kind of drunk a working man got on a Saturday, where his tongue moved easier than it did the rest of the week, and his eyes wet a little when a thing was said that touched him. She had a plate of cornbread and a bowl of beans saved out for him in the warming oven, because she had seen him out in the west pasture at supper time and known he would come down hungry. And she set the plate on the back step, and she sat down on the step next to him with her own cup of coffee. And he ate. He was quiet a while. Then he said, "Miss Frances." "Bert, you ever knowed Mrs. Calder?" "No, sir, she was gone before I came." She was a small woman. He held up his hand at his own shoulder. "About so quick, never still. Kept books on this place, tighter than Scripture." "Tighter than Scripture, ma'am. I worked for her 10 years, and I never seen her be off by a penny." Frances drank her coffee. She did not say anything. "Nobody's seen them books since the funeral," Bert said. "Boss won't go in that kitchen, won't open the cupboards, won't open the writing desk in the front room, won't say her name out loud. Books are in this house somewhere, Miss Frances. They're in this house. She wouldn't have took them with her, and she wouldn't have left them where nobody could find them. She'd have put them where the right person would know to look." He looked at her sidelong. "Purse." "I figure," he said, "she'd have put them in the kitchen." Frances looked out at the yard. "Eat your supper, Bert," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He ate. He finished. He sat with the empty plate on his knees a while, and then he said, "Thank you, ma'am, for the supper, and for the rest of it. Good night, Bert." "Good night, ma'am." He went off across the yard slow, and she sat on the back step a long time after he was gone, and the moon came up over the ridge behind the barn, and she did not get up to go in until she was cold. Eleanor Hollis rode out on Sunday afternoon. Frances had heard the name in town. Eleanor Hollis was the widow the town was named after. She was 71 years old, and she had buried 2 husbands and 3 sons, and she ran 4 sections of grazing land south of the creek, with the hand of a woman who had been doing it long enough that no man on her place mistook her for anything but the owner. She rode a tall bay mare, and she rode it well. She came up the road at a steady walk, and she dismounted at the gate without help, and she walked up to the porch, carrying a tin of something covered with a cloth, and she said when Frances opened the door, "Miss Whitmore, I am Eleanor Hollis. I have brought you a tin of plum preserves, and I have come to take tea, if you have any." "I have coffee," Frances said. "That'll do," said Eleanor Hollis. Eleanor Hollis sat at the kitchen table for an hour and a half. She drank 2 cups of coffee. She watched Frances move around her kitchen. She watched Frances feed the bunkhouse hands their Sunday dinner and pack up a basket for Cleve to ride out to 2 hands working at the far end of the property. And she watched Frances take a tray into Holt in the office, because Holt had been at the desk since breakfast and would not come out. And she watched Frances come back out without the tray and pick up her apron and go back to her bread. Eleanor Hollis did not say much. She asked one question about the flour, and one about where Frances had cooked before, and one about Hetty Cordell, whose name she had heard of, and she nodded at the answers, and she drank her coffee, and at the end of the hour and a half she stood up and she walked, without asking leave, through the kitchen and down the hall to the door of Holt's office. And she opened the door without knocking, and she stood in it. Frances could hear her from the kitchen. Eleanor Hollis did not lower her voice. Holt called her, "Mrs. Hollis, I have known you since you were a boy of 12, and your father brought you up this creek on the back of a mule, and I have not said a word to you about your business in 4 years, because grief is a man's own to carry. I am going to say one word to you now. Yes, ma'am, that woman in your kitchen is the finest woman who has set foot on this creek in 30 years. And you are a damned fool if you let her cook for anybody but you. Do you hear me, Holt? I hear you. Good day to you." She came back down the hall. She picked up her hat. She paused at the door, and she looked at Frances at the table with her hands in a bowl of dough, and she said, "Miss Whitmore, the next time you come to town, you come and see me. I have a chair by my fire that is yours when you want it." "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis." "Eleanor, Eleanor." Hollis went out. She mounted her tall bay mare from the porch step without help, and she rode off down the creek road at a steady walk, and Frances stood at the window, watching her go until she was around the bend out of sight, and she said quiet to herself, "Well, that was the thing about Eleanor Hollis. She would learn." Eleanor did not say a thing she did not mean, and she did not say it twice. The second week the neighbors began to come. The first was a man named Carver, from a small place 2 miles down the creek, who rode up on a Sunday afternoon, with his wife, on the bench beside him, and 3 children in the wagon bed, and he stopped at the gate and took off his hat and called up to the house, called her. "I heard tell up at the Mercantile there might be a piece of pie up here, for a man with a coin to spend." Frances had a peach pie cooling on the sideboard. She had 2, in fact. She had made them out of the last of the put-up peaches in the cellar, and a crust she had cut with the rim of a tin cup, because the Calder kitchen did not own a pie pan, and she had had to bake them in the bottoms of 2 cake tins. Holt came out on the porch and looked at Carver, and looked at the wagon, and looked back through the door at Frances, and Frances wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Tell him to come in, and bring his family, and there will be supper at 6, and pie after, and it will be 25 cents a head and 10 for the children." Holt told him. Carver and his wife and his 3 children ate at the kitchen table that night, with Holt and the hands, and Carver paid in coin and his wife paid in a half-pound of butter she had brought as a hostess gift and would not take back. And they went home in the dark with a lantern hung on the wagon, and Carver's wife with her arm through her husband's arm. And, on Monday morning, 2 more wagons came up the creek before noon. By Wednesday there was no Sunday, and Tuesday and Wednesday there was only supper, every night, with strangers at the table and Frances at the stove, and Holt at the head of his own table, looking at his neighbors for the first time in 4 years, and the coin in the jar on the window-sill grew. And the bunkhouse, which had been 3 windows dark when she came, was 4 windows lit by Thursday, and 5 by Saturday. Because 2 of the drifters who had drifted off in the lean years had drifted back at the news that there was a cook on the Calder place who would feed a man twice if a man would work. She had to send to town twice that week for more flour. She did not buy it through Hollis Creek Feed and Supply. She bought it through Mr. Bling. Pell at the Mercantile paid in coin out of the windowsill jar, and the price she paid was $3.30 a barrel, and she said nothing about it to Holt, and she did not have to. On Friday afternoon she ran out of pans. She had bread to bake for 40 mouths on Saturday. The Carvers were coming back with 2 other families, and Eleanor Hollis had sent word she would come with a guest. And the bunkhouse was up to 7 hands now, and the office had a cattle buyer in it from Cheyenne. And she had 4 loaf pans, and she needed 12. The pie tins were full of pies. The skillets were full of skillets work. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, at 4 in the afternoon, with her hands on her hips, and she looked at the closed door at the far end of the kitchen. The door she had not opened in 3 weeks, because it was not hers to open. The door to the small back kitchen Mrs. Byard Calder had used as her bake-room and her pantry. Both the door Holt had not gone through in 4 years. She wiped her hands on her apron. She went out to the office. Holt was at the desk with the cattle buyer, and he looked up at her in the doorway. And she said, "Holt, I need pans. There's pans in the back kitchen, may I?" He looked at her a long moment. The cattle buyer looked at his hands. "Yes," Holt said. "Take whatever you need." "Thank you." She went back. She stood in front of the door. She put her hand on the latch. She stood that way a moment with her eyes closed, because there was a way to walk into a room a dead woman had loved, and the way was the same way she had walked into the first kitchen 3 weeks before, only more so, and she gave herself the moment, and then she opened the door. The room was small. It was tidy. It had a window over a small work table, and a row of shelves on the wall, and a flour bin built into the corner with a heavy hinged lid, and the air in it was dry and cool and smelled of nothing at all. Because a room sealed up 4 years smelled of nothing at all in the end. There were pans on the shelves. There were 6 loaf pans and 4 bread pans, and 2 angel cake pans, and a cluster of small tartlet tins in a rack on a peg. There were rolling pins. There was a marble slab someone had brought up this creek by wagon at some cost, and set into the corner of the work table for the rolling of pastry, and the slab was unmarked and clean. Frances took the pans down. She took 6 loaf pans and the 4 bread pans, and she stacked them in her apron. And she straightened, and her eye caught on the flour bin in the corner. She had 8 pans in her apron. She did not need anything in the flour bin. But Bert had said, "The books are in this house somewhere, Miss Frances." She'd have put them where the right person would know to look. And Frances Whitmore had been the cook in enough kitchens in her life to know where one cook would hide a thing from anyone who was not another cook. She set the pans down on the work table. She crossed to the flour bin. She put her hand on the lid. It was a heavy lid, hinged at the back, lined with tin on the inside so the flour would not draw damp. She lifted it. The bin was about a quarter full of old flour, gone yellow at the top with age. She brushed her hand across the top of the flour, and she felt it. The small hardness under the surface in the back left corner. The shape of a thing that was not flour. She pushed the flour aside with the flat of her hand. She felt the oilcloth wrapping first. She lifted the bundle out. It was a book. It was a thick book, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with brown twine. It was heavier than it had any business being. She set it on the work table, and she untied the twine with hands that were steady because her hands were always steady. And she folded back the oilcloth, and she opened the cover. The handwriting on the first page was small and sharp and even and beautiful. It was the handwriting of a woman who had been taught to write by a schoolmistress who had cared about it, and it was the handwriting of a woman who had taken pride, every day of her life, in keeping her hand exactly the same on a Monday in February as it was on a Friday in July. The first page said at the top, in that same hand, Calder Ranch, Ledger of Account begun January the 1st, 1879, kept by the hand of Mary Eliza Calder. Frances turned a page. She turned another. She read the entries for January and February of 1879. She read the entries for the supply wagon, line by line. She read the price, per bar, rel of flour. It was $3.10. She read the price of cracked corn. It was $2.15 a hundredweight. She read the line for the loan note from the bank. There was a line in Mary Eliza Calder's hand, marked Bank of Hollis Creek, A. Marsh, prop, and a figure beside it, and a column of monthly interest computed in that same neat handwriting, and the rate written out at the top of the column, in words and in numerals. 6 per centum per annum. Frances knew the territorial maximum legal rate. Hetty had taught it to her in case she was ever asked to set her name to a thing for the boarding house. The territorial maximum legal rate was 8 per centum per annum. She turned to the back of the ledger. She turned to the most recent entries. There were no entries after April of 1879, because Mary Eliza Calder had gone into the fever the last week of April and had not come out of it, but there was, tucked into the back cover of the ledger, a folded sheet of paper. Frances opened the sheet. It was a letter. It was begun in the same hand, and it was unfinished, and it was dated the 22nd of April, 1879, and it was addressed to a clerk of the Territorial Bank Examiner at the Capitol. It began, "To whom it may concern. I write to inquire after the proper means of bringing a complaint against a banker of this territory for the charging of interest in excess of the lawful rate, and for the further matter of the said banker holding silent and undisclosed partnership in the supply concern which sells goods to the borrowers of his bank," by which means the letter stopped there. The pen had been set down. The ink at the end of the last word was darker than the rest, where it had pooled while the writer thought of the next phrase, and the writer had not come back to it. Frances stood with the ledger open in her hands. Hoofbeats sounded in the yard. She did not at first hear them. She was reading the unfinished line for the second time, holding the loose sheet flat against the open ledger, with her thumb. But the hoofbeats were of more than one horse, and they did not stop at the gate, the way a neighbor's horse stopped. And at the second pass of them she lifted her head, and she crossed to the small window over the work-table, and she looked out into the yard. There were 2 riders at the gate. One of them was a young man in a town coat with a roll of paper in his hand and a hammer at his belt. He had dismounted and was walking up to the front porch. The other was a heavier man on a fine sorrel horse, mounted his hands, folded easy on the saddle horn, watching. He was perhaps 60. He wore a black coat and a black hat, and a watch chain across a vest she could see the gleam of from where she stood. He was not looking at his man. He was looking at the house. He was looking at the window of the back kitchen. He was looking at her. The young man with a paper went up the porch steps. She heard the first ring of the hammer through the wood of the house, the small, bright sound of a tack going into Holt's front door. She heard the second. Mull. She heard the third. She heard the young man come down off the porch and remount, and she did not move from the window. And the older man on the sorrel did not move either. He sat his horse easy at the gate of the Calder ranch with the late afternoon sun behind him, and he looked at Frances Whitmore through the glass of Mary Eliza Calder's bake-room window, and he lifted one gloved hand and he touched the brim of his hat to her, slow the way a man tips his hat to a woman he has been expecting to meet all autumn. Aldous Marsh. She knew his name, without being told it. She had known it the moment she saw the watch chain. She did not move. She did not flinch. She stood in the doorway of the dead woman's kitchen, with the dead woman's ledger open in her hands, and the dead woman's unfinished letter held flat under her thumb, and she watched Aldous Marsh tip his hat to her through the glass, and she watched him wheel his horse and ride off down the creek road. And she stood there a long moment after the dust had settled at the gate. Then she closed the ledger. She wrapped it in its oilcloth. She tied the twine. She picked up her stack of loaf pans, and she carried the pans and the ledger together out of the small back kitchen, and she set the ledger on the high shelf above the stove behind the tin of cinnamon, where no man in the house would think to look, and she set the pans on the work table, and she went, with her hands wiped on her apron, out through the kitchen and down the hall and through the front room to the front door of Holt Calder's house. The notice was nailed to the door at eye height. It was on heavy bank paper. And the ink at the top was wet enough still that it had not entirely set in the cool of the afternoon. It said, in a printer's block hand, Notice of Foreclosure. To Holt Calder, owner of record, Bank of Hollis Creek, A. Marsh. Prop. U.R. Harrowby, notified that the note upon the premises known as the Calder Ranch, Hollis Creek, being in default, will be called in full at the expiration of 30 days from the date below written, and the premises sold at public auction on the steps of the county court at Hollis Creek on the 29th day of October, 1883. Frances Whitmore stood in front of the door a long time. She did not call for Holt. She did not pull the notice down. She read it once, and she read it twice, and she read the date at the bottom for a third time, and she folded her hands at her waist over her apron. And she stood looking at the paper, nailed to the wood of a door that had been opened to her 3 weeks before by a man who had not flinched at the sight of her. 30 days. She breathed once, long and quiet, and she lifted her chin and she said, almost under her breath, to the closed door and to the man on the sorrel horse. Down the road, and to the dead woman whose ledger was on the high shelf above her stove. And to her own self most of all. That was the thing about Frances Whitmore. When the world finally turned to look at her, she did not look away. She did not go inside straight away. She walked the porch first, slow, the way she walked a kitchen, before she committed to a meal, taking the measure of what was there and what was not. The notice cracked in the wind behind her. The sorrel horse and its rider were already moving back down the creek road at a walk, not a trot, because Aldous Marsh wanted her to watch him leave the way. A man leaves a thing he is sure of. She watched him until the road bent through the cottonwoods and took him out of sight. And then she turned and went back into the house. The ledger was where she had set it down on the kitchen table, open to the page she had been reading when the hoofbeats came. She closed it carefully. She set the brown envelopes from the mantel beside it in a stack, oldest underneath, newest on top. She lit the lamp because the light in the kitchen had begun to go blue at the windows. She set the kettle. She did not call Holt in from the corral where she could hear him talking low to a yearling that had cut its leg on wire that morning. She wanted an hour. She wanted to know what she was carrying before she set any of it down in front of him. The kettle came to its small singing boil, and she poured it over a measure of black tea and let it stand. She sat down at the table. Sayre. She opened the ledger again. The hand was beautiful. That was the first thing. Margaret Calder. Holt had said the name once, only once, in the second week, and Frances had filed it away and not made him say it again. Had written her figures the way some women embroider, with a steady, careful slant, and the kind of small round nines that suggest a schoolroom long ago and a teacher who measured a child's whole worth by penmanship. The columns were ruled in pencil and inked over. The headings were dated by month and by category. Feed, flour, salt, coffee, beef sold, beef kept, wages, note interest, note principal, note interest, note principal. Frances ran her finger down the column for note, interest, year 1879, and stopped, and went back to the top, and started again. 6%, the whole year through, every quarter, 6%, on the running balance. That was the rate Margaret Calder had recorded when she was the one carrying the figures from the bank to the kitchen. 6% was high, but 6% was lawful. 6% was a banker's honest squeeze on a man, with a creek, and good grass, and no quick way to a railhead. Frances closed the ledger again with her finger in the page, and reached for the stack of brown envelopes. The oldest was 1881. She slid the paper out, smoothed it flat, and held the lamp closer. 10%. She set the bank's statement next to Margaret's column and held both pages in the lamp circle and looked at them together. The principle was the same. The dates lined up. The bank's paper said 10%, where Margaret's said 6. It said 10% in the next statement, too, and in the next, and in every brown envelope after that, climbing by half a point and half a point again, until the most recent paper she lifted, dated August of this year, asked 13% of a man who had stopped reading his mail. Frances sat back. She drank a swallow of tea that had gone cool in the cup. She set the cup down without sound, 13% on a territorial note. She did not know the statute by its number, but she knew the number a banker was allowed to charge a rancher on the high plains because she had cooked 4 winters in a boarding house in Cheyenne, where every man at the long table had an opinion about the territorial usury cap, and most of them were correct. 8% was the ceiling, anything past 8 was void. She turned the page of the ledger. There, in Margaret Calder's small round hand, in a margin near the top, was a single underlined word and a date. Statute, it said, the 7th of September. Then a second line beneath it, also underlined, also dated. A week later. Letter to Capital, begin. Frances breathed once, slow, and rested her hand flat on the page, the way she rested a hand on rising dough to feel whether it was ready. So Margaret had seen it too. Margaret had seen the rate climb. Margaret had begun to draft a letter to the territorial capital. And then Margaret had taken fever, and Holt had ridden for the doctor down a road too long to ride in time, and the letter had never been sent, and the ledger had been wrapped in oilcloth and put under a flour bin, where a grieving man would not find it, because a grieving man does not go into the kitchen of his dead wife to look under things. But a woman, the town called Furniture, went into that kitchen because she needed more pans. Frances let that sit a moment, because it was the kind of fact a person did not allow themselves to feel all at once. She closed the ledger and set it on top of the brown envelopes, and turned the lampwick down because she did not need it any brighter to keep thinking. The supply bills. She pulled those out next, from the canvas pouch, by the back door, where Holt dropped them when the wagon came. She had been watching the wagon for 3 weeks now. She knew already that the flour was light. She had weighed a sack on the smokehouse scale the second Friday, and lost 4 pounds against the marked weight, and the next sack lost 3, and the one after that lost 5. She had said nothing about it yet. She had been watching to see if it was a careless driver or a careful one. She laid the bills out in a row on the table, the way she laid out vegetables before a stew. By kind flour, cornmeal, coffee, lard. The flour bills were $1.50 a hundredweight. She had paid $1.10 in Cheyenne in April for the same grade. The cornmeal was almost double. The coffee was triple, and not a coffee she would have served to a man she did not like. The salt was the only honest item on the page. She read the letterhead. Hollis Creek Mercantile and Supply, it said, in copperplate, with a small printed seal. Beneath that said the same in smaller letters. There was no other name, no proprietor printed at the bottom. No silent partner anywhere on the paper. She remembered then what Bert had said 2 nights ago with stew in his beard, and gratitude making him loose. Nobody had ever quite known who owned the supply. The storekeeper at the mercantile drew a salary. The wagon driver drew a salary. The prices came down off a slate behind the counter, and nobody asked who chalked them. Frances put her hand flat on the letterhead and held it there. A note inflated past the legal cap. A supply concern whose owner did not put his name on his own paper. A rancher who had stopped reading either. and a banker who had ridden out tonight to sit a horse at the gate and tip his hat through the glass at the woman who had finally lifted the flour bin. She did not put it together in a single tidy sentence in her head. She did not need to. She had cooked too long for too many men to believe that 1 bad price was an accident, and 3 were a pattern, and 5 were a plan. She knew the shape of a thing being skimmed off the top of a man's life, by a hand he could not see, because she had watched 2 boarding houses go under that way, in 12 years. And she had watched a widow in Cheyenne lose a milk route to a clerk who routed the receipts through his cousin's name. And she had said nothing then, because it had not been her place to say. It was her place now. She had taken the key 3 weeks ago, and she had not given it back, and she had hung an apron from a peg by the stove. And the man who had handed her that key had stood in his own house tonight, and put her trunk back where she had unpacked it. And so the shape of this fraud was hers to read. She heard Holt's boots on the porch then, and the small grunt he made when he stooped to pull them off at the door. He came into the kitchen in his stocking feet, the way a man comes into a room when he is not sure whether the room is his anymore, and he stopped when he saw the table. He looked at the ledger, he looked at the brown envelopes, he looked at the supply bills laid out by Kind. He looked, last, at Frances, sitting at her own kitchen table, with her hands folded over the closed book. "Sit down, Mr. Calder," she said. "I've made tea." He sat. She did not push the ledger toward him. She turned it instead, so the page she had been reading was right side up under his eyes, and she set Margaret's column of 6% next to the bank's most recent 10 and 11 and 13, and she let him do the seeing himself, because some things a man has to find with his own eyes, or he will not believe he found them at all. He read the page. He read it again. He set his cup down without drinking from it. His hand stayed near the cup for a long moment, as if he was not sure where else to put it. "That's her hand," he said very low. "Yes." He touched the edge of the page with one knuckle, not the writing, the margin, where Margaret's small letters had spelled the word statute and underlined it. "Where?" he said. "In the flour bin, under the oilcloth." He nodded once. He did not ask why she had been in the bin. He did not ask why she had not called him. He was, she understood, a man who had walked past that bin for 4 years without lifting it, and he was not going to pretend now that he wished he had. "The rate," he said, "8 is the cap. They are charging you 13. They have been charging you over 8 since 1881. Then the note is void. Where it sits, yes, we will need a judge to say so, and the supply." She turned over the top bill and tapped the letterhead. "No owner printed. Bert says nobody knows. Eleanor will know, or know who to ask." He was quiet a long time. He looked at the bills, and then at his wife's ledger, and then out the dark window where Marsh and the sorrel horse had been an hour before. "Marsh," he said, "it was not a question. That's what I would bet a week of suppers on." He pushed his cup an inch away from himself. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He said, "He sat that horse and watched you find it. He did. He wanted you to find it. He wanted somebody to find it now that the 30 days were nailed up. He thinks finding it does him no harm. He thinks the paper is too far gone." Holt looked at her then. He had a way of looking at her that was not like the way other men looked at her. He did not start at her face and slide. He started at her face and stayed. He said, "Is it too far gone?" "No," Frances said. He nodded once. "All right," he said. He looked at the ledger again. "What do you need?" "Sleep first," she said. "Then a ride to town in the morning. I need to ask Eleanor Hollis one question, and I need to weigh a sack of flour on the mercantile scale with Tate standing next to me, and I need to write a letter to the territorial capital before the noon stage. You'll have the buckboard. I'll have the buckboard. She paused. Mr. Calder Holt, he said. She let the words sit between them a moment. She did not use it back. She said, Margaret saw this, she started a letter. She did not finish. I know, he said. Which she had not expected. He was looking at the page. She always knew before I did. I never could stand to read what she said in front of me, so she stopped setting it in front of me. Forey. His mouth moved as if he wanted to apologize to a woman who could no longer hear it, and then he did not. He said instead, Finish your letter. I will. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. He stood. He stood the way he did everything, without flourish. And he carried his cup to the basin, and rinsed it, and set it upside down on the towel, and he stopped at the door of the kitchen, and looked back at the table where his wife's ledger lay open, beside the woman who had found it. Frances, he said. Yes. Thank you. She did not say you are welcome. She did not say it was nothing. She bent her head a little, the way a person bends a head in church, and he understood it. And he went out, and she sat at the table until the lamp guttered. She did not sleep much. She had not expected to. She made a pot of oats before dawn, and put a saucepan of bacon on the back of the stove for the hands, and got her good shoes out of her trunk in the corner of the barn, where Holt had put it back the night Tate had moved it, and she changed into the dark gray dress she had been saving, the one she had not worn since the funeral of her last employer. Because she was going into town today, and she meant to be seen there as a woman who had come on business, Holt was already at the corral when she came out. He had the buckboard hitched. He handed her up himself, which he had not done before, and he held the reins out to her, which she took. And he said, Bert'll ride in behind you. He wants to. Send him Tate. She thought about that. She thought about Tate calling her the cook they hired by the pound, and Tate moving her trunk in the night, and Tate going white last week when she had set down a bowl of stew in front of him without speaking, and watched him eat it. Send Tate too, she said. I want him at the scale. Holt nodded. He stepped back from the wheel. He said, Marsh will have heard you went to town by 10 o'clock. I am counting on it. She drove down the creek road in the gray of early morning, with Bert on a mule a length behind her and Tate sullen on a bay horse another length back, and the cottonwoods dropped their yellow leaves on the buckboard as she went, and she did not look at the place under the gatepost where Marsh had sat his horse the night before. Hollis Creek in the morning was a different town. The Cracker Barrel was empty. The men who had laughed at her 3 weeks ago were out at their pastures or asleep off last night's drink. The storekeeper looked up when her shadow fell on his door, tried to find his usual smile and could not quite locate it, because the woman in the gray dress, carrying a canvas pouch, was not the woman he had pointed up the road to Calder's empty oven, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, which was not her name and not her title, but she let it pass. Miss, she said, friendly enough, I'd like to weigh a sack of flour. Please, weigh. Off your wagon, the one going out to Calder today. Tate here is going to lift it onto the scale. Bert will read the dial. I will write the number down. You will sign the slip. The storekeeper's smile finished going away. Miss Whitmore, I'm asking civil, Frances said. And I'd like to stay civil. Tate. Tate had come up behind her without her looking. He had his hat in his hand, which she had also not seen him do before. He said, Yes, ma'am, very low, and went past her to the back of the store, where the wagon was loaded. Bert followed him, and Frances followed Bert, and the storekeeper followed Frances because there was nothing else he could do. The sack came down off the wagon and onto the scale, and the dial swung and settled, and Tate read it out loud the way a man reads a sentence in court. 93 pounds, Miss Whitmore. "It is marked," she said at the top corner in red. "Read me what it is marked." Tate turned the sack. £100 even, Bert. 93 by the dial, miss, Bert said. And a hair under. The storekeeper had gone the color of skim milk. He said, "The scale is sometimes the scale." "Sign," Frances said, and held out a slip of paper she had written on the buckboard seat that morning, with the date and the marked weight and the dial weight and 3 lines for signatures. "I've signed it. Tate has signed it. Bert will sign it. You will sign it because if you do not sign it, I will weigh every sack on that wagon in front of every rancher's wife between here and the creek by supper time, and I will sign all of those too." He signed it. His hand shook. She folded the slip and put it in the canvas pouch, and she nodded to Tate, who put the sack back on the wagon, and she walked out of the store with Bert behind her and Tate behind Bert, and she crossed the street to the white-painted house, at the end of it where Eleanor Hollis kept her chickens behind a picket fence, and her opinions behind a screen door. Eleanor opened the door before Frances knocked. "Come in, Miss Whitmore," she said. "I have been expecting you for 2 days." The parlor was small and full of the kind of furniture a woman keeps for 50 years. Because the man who made it is dead. Eleanor Hollis was 81 years old, and her back was straight, and she sat Frances down on the horsehair sofa and poured coffee out of a silver pot. Her husband had brought up the Bozeman in 1862, and she did not ask Frances what she had come for. She waited. Frances said, "I have one question, ma'am. Ask. Who owns the Hollis Creek Mercantile and Supply?" Eleanor Hollis set her cup down. "R." She looked for a moment like a woman seeing a long-awaited rider come over the last rise of a road. Her mouth tightened, not in displeasure, in something nearer satisfaction. "I have waited," she said, 9 years, for someone to ask me that question in this parlor. I am asking it. Aldous Marsh, Eleanor said, owns 3/4 of it through a concern out of the capital called Bentley and Pierce. And the storekeeper draws a salary of $40 a month and a percentage of nothing. And the wagon driver draws 30. There is no Bentley and no Pierce. There is only Marsh. Can it be proved? In corporation records at the territorial capital, filed in 1874 under a clerk named Henry Boudreau, who owes me a favor I have not called in for 11 years. He is still there. I checked in August. Frances let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Will he send them to you? He will send them to me, by the next stage if I write him today. Write him today. I will write him this hour. Stay for the noon stage, I will put the letter in your hand. Frances drank her coffee. It was good coffee. Eleanor watched her drink it. After a moment, Eleanor said, Miss Whitmore. Yes, Mom? I told Holt Calder last week that he was a fool if he let you cook for anyone but him. I will tell you something now that I did not tell him. I have watched 4 ranches on this creek go under to that bank in 9 years. And I have watched the man who runs it sit in the front pew at the church on Sunday and put a silver dollar in the plate, and I have not been able to lay a hand on him. You have walked 6 miles up a road on foot with one trunk and laid a hand on him in 3 weeks. He laid it on himself, ma'am. I only picked up a flour bin. That, Eleanor said, is precisely what I mean. The letter took her 20 minutes. Frances ate a slice of pound cake while she waited, because Eleanor pressed it on her, and because she had not had pound cake in a year, and because a woman in a fight ate when she could. Eleanor sealed the letter with red wax and pressed her own initial into it with a brass seal that had belonged to her mother. And she put it into Frances's hand, and she said, I will come for the supper when you call it. I have been waiting to come for a supper at the Calder place for 4 years. I have not called it yet. You will. Frances rode home with the letter in the canvas pouch and the signed scale slip beside it, and Tate riding alongside her instead of behind, because, somewhere between the scale and the white-painted house, his place in the line had changed, and he had not asked permission to change it. They did not speak for a long stretch of the creek road. Then Tate said, looking straight between his horse's ears, "Miss Whitmore, Tate. I called you a thing my first week, I remember. My mother is 64 years old, and weighs 200 pounds, and raised 7 of us by herself, and I have never in my life said a word like that about her, and I do not know why I said it about you. I know why, Tate ma'am. Because the men at the Cracker Barrel said it first, and you wanted them to think you belonged to them and not to me. You are a young man, and you wanted to belong somewhere. There is no shame in wanting that. There is shame in what you said. You can carry the one without carrying the other." He was quiet a long time. He said, "Whatever you need me to say, in front of whoever you need me to say it in front of, I will say it. I will need you to say it in front of a judge. All right. In front of the whole county, too. All right." She let that be enough. She did not extract a thing more from him. He had given it, and a thing given was a thing one did not press on after. They came up the creek road in the long shadow of the afternoon, and Frances saw, before they reached the gate, that a second notice had been nailed to the door beside the first. She drew the buckboard up. She did not get down right away. Bert rode up beside her and read the second notice over her shoulder, and swore very softly the way an old man swears, with sorrow more than heat. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Frances said. The first notice had said 30 days. The second notice said the hearing had been moved up to the 15th day, Marsh had heard. Then, by 10 o'clock, exactly as she had told Holt he would. And he had not waited until 11 to answer. She climbed down. She took the canvas pouch with her. Holt came out onto the porch, and he had already read the second notice, and his face did not change when he saw her. He said, "He moved it. He moved it. How long do we have?" 15 days. Eleanor is writing the capital today. The papers should come on the stage by the 9th at the latest. The circuit judge is through here on the 11th. The 11th, Holt said. The hearing's the 15th. 4 days. 4 days is enough for a man like that to ride out and disappear. He will not ride out, Mr. Calder. He thinks he has already won. He believes you cannot read your own mail. He believes I cannot do arithmetic. He believes Eleanor Hollis is a sentimental old woman with a parlor. He's wrong on all 3. He's wrong on all 3. Holt looked past her at the second notice, and then at the men in the yard. The hands had drifted out of the bunkhouse, and were standing at the rail of the corral, the way men stand when they have heard a thing they were not meant to hear, and want to know if it is true. There were 9 of them now. There had been 4 her first week. Holt walked down off the porch and stood in front of them. He did not raise his voice. He never did. "Boys," he said, "the bank is trying to take this place. They moved the hearing up to the 15th. There's a chance we keep it, and there's a chance we don't. Anybody wants to draw his wages and ride before the hearing. He can do it tonight, and I won't think less of him. Anybody who stays, stays through whatever comes." Nobody moved. One of the new hands, a boy of 19 who had ridden in 2 days ago for the bread Bert had told him about in the saloon, spat to the side and said, "I'd as soon stay, Mr. Dower." Calder. And the others, in their own ways, said the same thing in turn, and Tate said it last. And Tate said it looking at Frances rather than at Holt. Holt said, "Miss Whitmore stays. I want that said out loud. She is on this place as long as she wants to be on this place. Anybody who has trouble with that takes it to me first and to her second." Nobody had trouble with it. "All right," Holt said. Back to work. They went back to work. He came up the porch steps to her and stopped one stair below, so they were eye to eye, and he said very low, "He sent word through the storekeeper this afternoon." "What word?" "That the fat woman had better be off the property before the marshal arrives." Frances did not flinch. She felt the small old place under her ribs, where words like that went when she did not let them go anywhere else, and she felt it accept the new weight, and she felt it hold. "He is afraid," she said. "He is afraid," Holt said. "Good." They went inside. She put the canvas pouch on the kitchen table, and the letter from Eleanor on top of it, and the scales slip on top of the letter, and she rolled up her sleeves, and she got the bread started for 10 extra mouths, because 2 of the new hands had brought their younger brothers, and the brothers were skinny and quiet, and looked at her stove the way calves look at a salt lick. She fed them. She fed them every night that week, while the days went by one and another, and the second notice cracked in the wind on the door, and nobody took it down because she had told Holt to leave it there. Because she wanted every man who rode in and every neighbor who rode out to see what was being done in plain daylight to a man who had not raised his voice once in 4 years. The papers came on the 9th, as Eleanor had said. They came in a thick brown packet with the territorial seal stamped on the outside, and a note from Henry Boudreau, the clerk at the Capitol, that said only, in a tidy small hand, "For Mrs. Hollis, with respect, and Mr. Proer." Boudreau hoped she was well. Eleanor rode up the creek herself, with the packet across her saddle horn, 81 years old, and sitting her mare like a woman of 50, and she carried the papers into the kitchen, and laid them down on the table beside Margaret Calder's ledger. The incorporation of Bentley and Pierce, dated April of 1874, listed 3 shareholders. Aldous H. Marsh, of Hollis Creek, 75 shares. Carlton Bentley, of the Territorial Capital, 12 shares, and a small handwritten margin note from Henry Boudreau, which read, "Deceased 1876. Shares, uncalled, presumed reverted." Edmund Pierce, of the Territorial Capital, 13 shares, and another margin note, "Deceased 1879. Ditto Marsh had owned the supply outright since 1879. He had owned the bank that held the Calder note the whole time. He had been short waiting and overcharging and quietly bleeding a creek of ranchers through one of his hands while taking their interest payments with the other, and he had begun to do it to the Calder place harder and faster after the fever year, because he had judged correctly that the rancher who lived there could not look at his own mail. Eleanor laid her hand on the papers and said, "There it is, Miss Whitmore." "There it is," Frances said. "And the rate?" Margaret kept the rate from 1879. The bank's papers from 1881 forward exceed the cap. The bank charged 13 by August. The note is void on its face under territorial statute. The lien, Marsh, filed in September, has no underlying enforceable debt to attach to. Then the supper, Eleanor said. Then the supper. Holt came in from the corral and stopped in the doorway, and Frances turned to him with her sleeves still rolled and her hands floured to the wrist, and she said, "Mr. Calder, I would like to host a supper here on the night of the 11th. Every rancher on the creek, every wife, every hand. Eleanor. The circuit judge as a private guest. Mr. Marsh, too, by your own written invitation, to defend his concerns in front of his neighbors. I would like to do this in your wife's kitchen." He looked at her a long moment. "Do it," he said. The 4 days between the 9th and the 11th were the hardest cooking Frances had done in her life, and the easiest, because there was not a minute in any of them when she did not know exactly what she was doing. She rode the creek herself, twice, in the buckboard, with Tate driving the second time so she could write notes on her lap as they went. She stopped at every gate. She did not ask. She invited. She said the words, "There will be a supper at the Calder place on the 11th, and you and Mrs. and your wife are welcome at it, and there will be a matter discussed that touches every ranch on this water." She did not say bank. She did not say marsh. She did not need to. The wives looked at her once and said yes before the men could answer, and the men said yes after, because their wives had already said it. She invited the storekeeper. He went red, and then white, and then said he would come. She invited the wagon driver. He said he would come, and he would bring his own scale. She wrote out the letter to Marsh herself, in her own hand, and Holt signed it. It was the politest letter she had ever written. It said only that Mr. Calder requested the pleasure of Mr. Byer Marsh's company at a supper at the Calder Ranch on the evening of November the 11th, that certain matters concerning the recent notices on the door would be aired in the company of his neighbors and a passing officer of the territorial court, that Mr. Calder hoped Mr. Marsh would do him the honor of being present to speak to those matters in his own voice. Tate carried it to town. He came back and said Marsh had read it twice in front of him, and put it in his desk drawer without a word. "He'll come," Tate said. "He'll come," Frances said. The judge arrived on the afternoon of the 11th, on a tired roan with a saddlebag and a black coat brushed clean of road dust. His name was Eustace Whitfield, and he was 62 years old. And he had been riding the fall rotation in the territory for 19 years. And he had heard in town that there was a supper at the Calder place that evening, and a woman cooking it, who had walked 6 miles up a road on her first day in the county, and he had said, when the storekeeper told him this, that he believed he would attend if a chair could be found for him. Eleanor had ridden into town that morning to see him. She had told him only one thing, which was that there would be papers laid in front of him at that supper, which he might wish to see laid in front of him, before a hearing he was due to convene 4 days later. He had said he would come. He came at 5. Frances met him at the gate herself, with her hands floured and her apron on, and she said, "Judge Whitfield, I am Frances Whitmore. I am the cook. I am very glad you are here. I do not mean to put you to work over your dinner. I mean only to lay some papers down where you can see them. You will tell me whether you wish to see them at the table or before." He looked at her once, a long, careful look out from under heavy white brows. And he said, "Miss Whitmore, I will see them at the table. If you please, I find I read better with bread in front of me." "You shall have both," she said. The yard had been transformed. Trestle tables had been built that afternoon by the hands at a saw lumber. Bert had been keeping under canvas behind the barn for 2 winters. Waiting for a reason, they ran in 3 lines down the long side of the yard with benches behind them and lanterns hung on poles between them. The bunkhouse boys had whitewashed the porch posts. The new boy of 19 had picked yellow asters out of the creek bottom and put them in canning jars down the center of every table. 6 jars to a table, because he had a sister back in Missouri who had taught him that flowers on a table were not vanity, but welcome. Holt had not said anything about the asters. He had walked past them twice, and looked at them both times, and not said anything. The neighbors began coming in at 5:30, in wagons and on horseback and on foot, up from the lower place. 80, by the time the sun went off the ridge. 81 with the judge. 82 with Eleanor Hollis on the bench at Frances's right hand. 83 with the storekeeper, who came alone and sat at the very end of the 3rd table, and would not meet anyone's eye. 84 with Marsh. Marsh came late. Marsh came in a black broadcloth coat, with a watch chain across his vest, and a face composed into the same small banker's smile he wore in the front pew on Sundays. He tied his horse himself at the gate. He walked up between the lanterns, He took the chair Holt indicated to him at the head of the second table, 3 down from the judge, with a clear sight line to the porch and the open kitchen door, and he sat down with his hat on his knee and folded his hands. Frances served. She had cooked for 3 days. Roast beef from one of Holt's own steers hung 4 days, and carved at the table by Bert, who had been a butcher in a previous life. Mashed potatoes with cream and salt and butter and nothing else, because nothing else was needed. Carrots glazed in honey from a hive Eleanor had sent down that morning in a covered crock. Pan gravy. Hot rolls in baskets lined with linen, 4 baskets a table refilled twice, cornbread in iron skillets cut into wedges, pickled beets from Eleanor's pantry, Glain, a green relish a Norwegian wife from Up Creek had brought, as her contribution because she had heard there would be a supper, and she would not come empty-handed. Apple pie, 8 pies, with cream skimmed that morning. Coffee, strong. In tin cups because there were not enough china. She did not sit. She moved between the tables with platters and pitchers, and refilled and refilled and refilled, and she said good evening and welcome, and please pass to the lady on your left, and she did not look at Marsh, and Marsh did not look at her. Holt sat at the head of the first table with Eleanor at his right, and the judge across from her, and he ate, slowly, the way a man eats who has not had a proper supper in his own house in 4 years. And once, between the roast and the pie. And his face did a thing it had not done in 4 years, which was to lose the line at the corner of his mouth that grief had put there. Eleanor Hollis stood between the roast and the pie. She did not ring on her glass. She did not call for attention. She stood. And because she was Eleanor Hollis, the yard quieted. 80 faces turned to her, and the lanterns moved on her white hair, and she set her napkin on the bench beside her, and folded her hands in front of her, over the buckle of her belt. "Friends," she said. Her voice was not loud. It carried because it never had to be loud. "I have lived on this creek longer than any of you. I came up it with my husband in 1856, and I buried him on it in 1869. And there is not a foot of this water I have not walked, and not a family on it I have not fed at one table or another. I have seen good women on this creek, and I have seen better, and I have a thing to say tonight about the woman who cooked this supper." She paused. She let it be quiet. "Frances Whitmore," she said, "is the finest woman to set foot on this creek in 30 years, and I will say it again at her grave if I outlive her, and at my own if I do not, and there is no man at this table who has eaten her bread tonight, who does not know it is true." She sat down. The yard did not applaud. It did something better. It went still, and then a low sound went through it. Men clearing their throats and women putting their hands flat on the table. And the storekeeper at the end of the third table put his face in his hands, and Marsh's small banker's smile thinned at the corners, but did not go away. Frances had stopped at the end of the first table with the coffee pot in her hand. She did not say thank you. She inclined her head a quarter-inch toward Eleanor, and Eleanor inclined hers back, and Frances went on around the table, and poured the judge's cup full. The judge said, very low, only to her, "Miss Whitmore, I believe I am ready for those papers." "Yes, sir," she said. She set the coffee pot down on the trivet, and she walked up to the porch, and she went into the kitchen, and she came back with 3 things. Margaret Calder's ledger, wrapped open to the page that mattered. The packet of brown envelopes, in order. Oldest underneath. Newest on top. And the brown territorial envelope from Henry Boudreau, with the seal on it, with Eleanor's red wax still on its second fold. She laid them, 1, 2, 3, in front of Judge Whitfield, between his bread plate and his coffee cup, and she said loud enough now for the whole yard to hear, because the time for being quiet was past, Judge Whitfield. These are the books my late Mrs. Calder kept on the note this bank holds against this ranch. These are the statements the bank has sent in answer. These are the incorporation records of the concern that has supplied this ranch with feed and flour and coffee. For 9 years, I would be obliged if you would read them in that order. The yard did not breathe. The judge read. He read with the slow attention of a man who had read 1,000 documents at 1,000 suppers and tavern tables and porch steps, in 19 years on the rotation, and who had not yet found the thing that could make him hurry. He read Margaret's column. He turned a brown envelope. He read it. He turned another. He read it. He looked for a long moment at the rate written at the top of the August statement. He set that envelope down. He picked up the territorial papers. He read the shareholders. He read Henry Bedreau's small margin notes. He set them down. He looked then not at Francis and not at Holt and not at Eleanor. He looked at Aldous Marsh. "Marsh," he said. His voice was conversational. The whole yard heard it. "These papers in front of me indicate that you are the sole effective owner of Bentley and Pierce, which trades on this creek as the Hollis Creek Mercantile and Supply, since the death of Mr. Pierce in 1879. They further indicate that the bank of which you are the president has charged this ranch interest on this note at a rate exceeding the territorial cap every quarter since 1881. They further indicate that the supply concern, of which you are silent owner, has invoiced this ranch at rates between 30 and 200% above the prevailing rate at the territorial capital over the same period. Would you care to address any of these matters before I take them up at the hearing on the 15th? The yard turned, as one body, to Marsh. Marsh stood up. He stood up the way a banker stands up slowly, smoothing his vest down with one hand. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He looked at Tate, 3 tables down, and Tate stood up too, without being asked, and said loud and clear, "Judge, I have a scale slip in my pocket signed by myself, and by Bert Halloran, and by the storekeeper of the Hollis Creek Mercantile, dated the 23rd of October. One a sack of flour invoiced, and marked as 100 pounds, and weighing on the Mercantile's own scale, 93 pounds and a hair under. I will swear to it." The judge said, "Sit down, son. I will take that slip from your hand at the hearing, Mr. Marsh," Marsh said. "Judge Whitfield, these are matters of accounting. They are not. Mr. Marsh," the judge said, "are these your incorporation papers?" "They appear to be." "Did you charge 13% on this note in August of this year?" Marsh did not answer. "Mr. Marsh." "Judge Whitfield, the territorial cap is a matter of interpretation." "It is a matter of statute," the judge said, "and the statute is on my saddle. I read it on the trail yesterday because Mrs. Hollis sent me a note last week which suggested I might want it fresh in mind. The cap is 8%. The note in front of me bears 13. The note is void. The lien filed in September has no debt to attach to. It is also void. The hearing on the 15th will not be a foreclosure hearing. It will be a hearing on whether the territorial bar wishes to continue to extend you the privilege of writing notes at all, Mr. Bruss. Marsh and I will be writing the Territorial Banking Commissioner this evening to ask the same question of your charter. Sit down, sir, or do not sit down. It is your supper as much as anyone's." Marsh did not sit. He looked then at Francis. He looked at her the way a man looks at the woman who has cost him a life he thought he had built, and his small banker's smile finally fell off, and what was under it was a face that did not know what to do without it. Francis looked back at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She held his look the way she held a stove handle, steadily, without flinching, until he turned his face away. He walked out between the lanterns. He untied his horse, He rode down the creek road in the dark, and the lantern light did not follow him very far. The yard held its breath one more second, and then let it out. And somebody at the third table, the Norwegian wife, laughed, one short, clean laugh of pure relief. And the laugh broke the spell, and the yard came back to itself in a slow rising sound of voices and benches creaking and cups being set down. And Frances picked up her coffee pot and walked back to the kitchen for it because that was what she did, that was what she had been doing all night, and a yard full of people who had just watched a fraud broken on the trestle tables in front of them, watched her go and understood at last what they had been eating. She fed them pie. She fed them coffee. She fed them in pairs and threes and fives until midnight, and the lanterns burned down one by one, and the wagons rolled out one by one with people calling thanks back across the yard. And Eleanor Hollis stood at the gate herself and shook every hand as it went past, because Eleanor Hollis understood ceremony. And the judge sat on the porch for a long while with Holt and finished his coffee and said, only before he went up to the bed Frances had made for him in the small room off the kitchen, "Mr. Calder, you have been quiet a long time. You picked a good night to come back." Holt said, "Yes, sir." The judge looked at the kitchen door, where Frances was washing the last of the plates in a basin, with her sleeves still rolled, and her hair come a little loose at the temple from the heat. "You picked a good woman, too," the judge said. "Yes, sir," Holt said. The judge went to bed. Holt sat on the porch a little longer. Then he stood up, slowly, and he went into the kitchen. Frances had her back to the door. She was rinsing a plate under the pump. The kitchen smelled of bread and coffee, and the faint, sweet ghost of apples that had been in the oven 6 hours ago, and the lamp on the table burned low and steady, and on the high shelf above the stove sat Margaret Calder's ledger, closed now, with the brown envelopes stacked beside it. Holt stopped just inside the door. "Frances," he said. She did not turn yet. She set the plate on the towel. She picked up another. She washed it. She set it on the towel. Then she turned, drying her hands on her apron, and she looked at him. He stood there a moment looking at her. He was, she saw, trying to find the words. And he was not a man who had ever found words quickly. And he was not going to start tonight. "I have something to say to you," he said. "Say it. Will you marry me? For P." She did not pretend to be surprised. She did not pretend to consider. She had known he would ask. She had not known when. She had not known whether he would manage it tonight, and that he had managed it tonight in his own kitchen, in front of his wife's ledger on the high shelf, with the dishes still in the basin and the lamp burning low. That was the thing that told her what to answer. "I have 3 conditions, Mr. Calder." "Holt, I have 3 conditions. Name them." "My name on the deed of this ranch beside yours, not as your wife, as an owner." "Yes, this kitchen rebuilt to my plan, not Margaret's plan." "Not your plan." "Mine. I will keep her ledger on the high shelf, and I will keep her photograph on the mantel, and I will keep her chair at the head of the table empty the first Sunday of every month, for as long as you want me to. But the kitchen is mine." "Yes." "And the books in my hand from this day on. Every bill that comes onto this place, every dollar that goes out, every head of cattle sold, every sack of flour weighed my hand." She had thought he would pause on at least one. She had thought he would want to think on the deed for a beat. He had not. He had said yes to all 3 before she had finished naming the third. She set the dish towel down on the edge of the basin. He stepped into the room. He stopped a foot from her. He reached, slowly, and he took her hand. He took the one that was still damp. He held it. He did not pull her toward him. He did not bend to her. He held her hand, and he looked at it. The broad, capable hand of a woman the town had called furniture 3 weeks ago. and he lifted it to his face and laid the back of it against his cheek. Oh! He held it there a moment. He did not say anything more. He did not need to. "All right, Holt," Francis said very quietly. "All right." He let her hand go. He did not kiss her. There would be time. He stepped back, and he said, "I will sleep in the bunkhouse tonight. We will go to the courthouse the day after the hearing." "That will do," she said. He went. She heard his boots on the porch, and the screen door, and the boots going down the steps and across the yard. And then she stood for a long minute in the lit kitchen, alone with the basin and the lamp and the ledger on the high shelf. And she put her hand, the one he had laid against his face, against her own cheek, briefly. And then she took it down and washed the last of the plates. The hearing on the 15th was a small thing in the end. It was held in the front room of the county court at Hollis Creek, with 11 people present, and took 41 minutes. Judge Whitfield voided the note, voided the lien, ordered the bank to refund the interest paid in excess of the cap since 1881, with simple interest itself at 4%, a sum that came to a little over $2,400. Marsh did not appear. The bank was represented by a junior clerk who had been left holding a stack of papers and a hat. The clerk said very politely that the bank would comply. The Territorial Banking Commissioner arrived on the 19th, and Marsh's charter was suspended within a week, and his license to practice as a notary was lifted within the month, and a quiet examination of the books at the Hollis Creek Mercantile and Supply, who had cried at the supper and not stopped crying for 3 days, was kept on at his salary by a new ownership group that Eleanor Hollis quietly organized among the wives of the Creek. Francis and Holt went to the courthouse together on the 17th, with Bert and Tate as witnesses, and were married by Judge Whitfield in his last act before he rode on to the next county on his rotation. Francis wore the gray dress. She did not buy a new one. The deed was filed that afternoon in both their names, undivided, joint with right of survivorship, and Francis signed her name on it slowly and carefully, and did not let her hand shake. The kitchen was rebuilt through the winter. She kept Margaret's ledger on the high shelf, and Margaret's photograph on the mantel, and Margaret's chair at the head of the table sat empty the first Sunday of every month, and Holt sat across from it and ate his supper and looked at it sometimes, and said nothing. The bunkhouse filled. By Christmas there were 14 hands. By spring there were 18. Tate was made foreman in February. He did not call her ma'am any more. He called her Francis, because she had asked him to, once, and he had said all right. And after that, he did. He took a wife in the spring himself, a quiet, dark-haired girl from Up Creek who had come to the supper with her father and not stopped thinking about it, and Francis stood up with her at the wedding. Eleanor Hollis came to Sunday supper at the Calder place every Sunday. She was able to from the 11th of November forward, for as long as she lived. She lived 4 more years. She left her parlor furniture to Francis in her will, including the silver coffee pot her husband had brought up the Bozeman in 1862, and Francis put the coffee pot on the sideboard in the new kitchen and used it every Sunday for the rest of her life. The first snow on Hollis Creek that year came the second week of December. It came in the night, and Francis was up before light, because she always was kneading bread at the long new table in front of the long new window Holt had cut into the west wall of the kitchen for her, because she had asked for a window that looked out on land that was half hers now, and he had cut it the same week she asked. She was alone in the kitchen, the lamps were lit, the stove was warm, the bread was good. She could see, through the window in the gray first light, a thin figure coming up the creek road on foot. No horse. No coat heavy enough for the weather, hat in hand. She knew him by his walk before she saw his face. She kept kneading for a moment. She set the dough in the bowl. She covered it with the cloth. She wiped her hands on her apron. She took down a bowl from the shelf, not the good china, the ordinary tin, and she ladled stew from the pot on the back of the stove. The stew from last night's supper that she had kept warm because there had been a hand out checking a fence in the cold, and she had not been sure when he would come in, and she put a hunk of bread on top of the stew. And she took it out to the back step. She opened the door. The cold came in. She set the bowl down on the step. She set a spoon in it. She set a tin cup of coffee beside it. She did not call out. She did not look down the road. She left the door open a hand's width and went back to her bread. She heard, a few minutes later, the small sound of a man on the step. She heard the spoon against the tin. She heard him eat slowly, the way a man eats who has not eaten in a day or more. She did not look out. She needed the second batch. When the spoon stopped, she heard him set the bowl down. She heard him stand. She heard very quietly the words, "Thank you, Mrs. Calder," in the voice of Aldous Marsh, and she heard his footsteps go off the step and around the corner of the house and away down the road in the snow. She went out, when he was gone, and she picked up the bowl and the cup and the spoon, and she carried them back into the kitchen and washed them in the basin and dried them, and put them back on the shelf where they belonged. She did not tell Holt that morning. She told him that night, plainly, and he listened, and he said only, "All right, Francis," and ate his supper. Marsh came once more that winter, on a colder morning, and she fed him again. He did not come a third time. Tess. She heard, in the spring, from Eleanor, that he had taken work as a clerk in a feed store down in Cheyenne, under a different name, and was living in a single room above it, and she nodded when she heard it, and did not say anything, and she did not think about him again for a long while. That first snow morning she stood at the long window for a moment after she had washed the bowl, with her hands floured to the wrist again, and a second loaf rising in the pan and the stove warm at her back, and she looked out at the yard and the bunkhouse and the corral and the long stretch of creek bottom, going white under the snow. The lanterns from last night still hung on their poles between where the trestle tables had stood at the supper, and somebody, Tate, probably had taken them down and stacked them by the barn for next time, because there would be a next time, because the county had learned, on the night of the 11th of November, that there was a table at the Calder place, and the county would come back to it. She looked at the land that was half hers now. She looked at it a long time. She had been called furniture 3 weeks after she got off the stage at Hollis Creek, and a thing they hired by the pound her first morning in the bunkhouse, and the fat woman by a banker who had thought she could not read his arithmetic. She had heard all of it. She had let all of it land where it landed, and stay where it stayed, and she had not made herself smaller for any of it, and she had not made herself thinner, or prettier, or quieter. And she had not bent her back an inch. Bent. Huff. She had walked 6 miles up a road, in good shoes, with one trunk. She had asked to use an oven for one night, and she had stayed, and she had fed 80 people from that oven. On a night that turned a county, and she had married the man who had handed her the key without flinching at the sight of her, and her name was on the deed in her own hand. She had not been invisible. She had never been invisible. The county had simply not been hungry enough yet to look. And when at last it had been, when at last a man with a creak, and a closed kitchen, and a swollen note, and a grief he could not carry alone, had looked up from his tack at dusk, to find a heavy, broad-shouldered woman standing in his yard asking plainly for the use of his oven, the county had looked, and it had seen her, and it had not looked away again. She turned from the window. The bread was ready for the oven. She slid the loaves in, and closed the door, and wiped her hands on her apron, and went to wake the house. She had earned every acre of it, and every plate on the long table, and every cup on Eleanor's sideboard, and the chair at the head where Margaret's place was kept, and the chair across from it where Holt now sat, and the chair beside Holt's where she sat herself. She had earned the lit doorway, and the full house, and the snow on the yard, and the warm stove, and the long window cut into the west wall for her. She had earned the morning, and the next morning, and every morning after. She had never been invisible. The county had simply not been hungry enough yet to look. And now it was, and now it had, and now it would not forget.